Now here's a new piece of information she brought up. She's the first one that identified Sidney Rigdon as having been directly associated with this. She said Sidney Rigdon was connected with Mr. Patterson's printing office at this time. This wasn't based on speculation like previous newspaper articles. This was actually based on her testimony. So this was the first time a direct witness brought this up. She said Rigdon had ample opportunity to examine and copy the manuscript. The manuscript was ultimately returned to her and preserved by her. So she was sure the manuscript had been returned to Solomon and that she preserved it. And Hurlbut retrieved that very manuscript that she believed to be manuscript found. Now this is an important point for those that are defending the apologetic response, which we'll talk more later. Rigdon immediately responded. Now, this was in early 1839, so this would have been right after they were driven out of Missouri and arrived in Nauvoo. So very early in Nauvoo. He denounced it as scandalous lies. There were ad hominem attacks on Mrs. Davison, Spalding, and Hurlbut and Howe. I'm talking pages of diatribe. He denied, here are the important points though, he denied ever being in Pittsburgh before 1822. He denied having known Solomon Spalding, and he denied any association with the Pittsburgh printing office before 1822. Now, Mrs. Davison did acknowledge later that the statement was drafted by the Reverend Austin, and she signed it, but she said it was in the main true. So the Nauvoo Times pronounced her statement as a base forgery and the product of Reverends Austin and Storrs. Okay, now Sidney Rigdon was born in St. Clair Township, Pennsylvania in 1793, and he lived there till he was about 25 years of age. Notice where that is. That's only about 8 miles outside of the center of Pittsburgh. So he was, for all practical intents, born in what would be today a Pittsburgh suburb. And that's where Amity was, where Spalding later, where he passed away in 1816. For about a year, he went and studied theology as an apprenticeship, and it was in areas surrounding Pittsburgh. And then in 20, he moved to northeastern Ohio, and he became a circuit preacher, and he first there became introduced to Alexander Campbell. He came back to Pittsburgh in 1822, and remember he said, I'd never been in Pittsburgh before 1822. So he officially lived in Pittsburgh in 1822, and he was the pastor for 2 years of the First Baptist Church, and he was dismissed as a heretic in 1824, mostly to do with Alexander Campbell's restorationism theology. So he continued to preach on Sundays in the courthouse for a couple more years in Pittsburgh on Campbell's restorationism. And then in 26, he moved to northeastern Ohio became a Campbellite Baptist preacher. He first moved to Bainbridge, Ohio, then later to Mentor. And he was converted to Mormonism in November of 1830. The superscript here simply means I have more information back in my references in the back. We won't be going over those, but in the handout or in the online version will be available. And he first met Joseph Smith in 1830, according to the official church biography. And Bainbridge is located Cleveland sits about right here, so it's a little bit east of Cleveland. And just as a side note, and then he later moved to Mentor, and he did his preaching in Kirtland. But when he lived in Bainbridge, we have a couple witnesses that we'll get to why this is relevant and why I'm showing this. Just as a side note, up here in Chardon, this is in Geauga County, New York, or Ohio. In Chardon is where I believe it was March of 1837, is where Joseph Smith was tried for bank fraud. That's where that trial took place, was in Chardon. Okay, Joseph Miller and Reddick McKee, these are important statements that were made, but they weren't published until between 1869 and 1886. Joseph Miller went on record a couple of times, and Reddick went on record once that I recall. They were neighbors of Spalding while he lived in Amity for 2 years. In fact, McKee was also a boarder with Spalding. Spalding earned some of his income by renting out rooms. According to Miller and McKee, Spalding shared with them the storyline, the narrative, and made the following observations. Spalding claimed that he knew Rigdon from Patterson's printing office. So this is the information that directly ties Spalding with Rigdon, is the testimony of Miller and McKee. Spalding said he assumed that Rigdon was employee of the printing office. He said Rigdon had read parts of the manuscript and opined to him that it would sell well. He said these two witnesses said the manuscript was written on detached sheets of foolscap paper. Foolscap paper was 12 inches by 16 inches, big large pieces of paper, and they were loose, detached sheets. This is relevant relative to whether the extant manuscript is the one in question. We'll get to that later. And Spalding had suspected that Rigdon had spirited away his manuscript from the printing office when it had disappeared for a time. Now we get to the statement of Rebecca Eichbaum. She made this statement in 1879, well, when she was age 87. She was fairly old, moving on in age at that time. She said her father was the postmaster during the period in question between 1804 and 1822. But she also assisted in his duties at the post office and was a regular clerk between 1811 and 1816. Her husband, by the way, replaced her father in 1822, so she was still involved in the in the post office to some degree, even beyond 1860. Anyway, she claimed that she knew Solomon Spalding, that she knew Sidney Rigdon, that she knew Robert and Joseph Patterson. They were the owners of the print shop. She knew Jonathan Lambden, and he was an employee in the print shop. And Silas Ingalls, he was the Patterson's printer, and he was co-located in the same building doing the printing. Here's the important information. She said Rigdon and Lambden, again, Jonathan Lambden was an printing office employee. She says, they were friends and frequently visited the Pittsburgh post office together, quite often on Sundays. They were open for a couple hours on Sundays. And she recalls Ingalls saying that Rigdon was always hanging around the printing office, and Rigdon was connected with the tannery. The tannery was a business that produced the leather bindings for books. So Sidney Rigdon was involved in that. It was known he was involved in that after he moved to Pittsburgh in 1822. It wasn't known he was involved in that earlier. Anyway, the Mormon response that I put here was an early response by B.H. Roberts, who said it was just unsubstantiated ramblings of a very old woman. Okay, let's now go to Mrs., I forget her first name, but A. Dunlap, that was Rigdon's niece. We're going to cover some testimony that there were witnesses actually witnessed or claimed to have seen the manuscript that Rigdon had. She said, when I was a child, I visited Mr. Rigdon's family between 1826 and 1827. He married my aunt, and they at the time lived in Bainbridge. Now you recall where Bainbridge was, just east of Cleveland. Lived in Bainbridge, Ohio. She says, during my visit, Mr. Rigdon went to his bedroom and took from the trunk, which he kept locked, a certain manuscript